Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that while America has been focused on oil pipelines and trade wars, Canada has quietly executed the most sophisticated resource strategy in modern history, one so devastating in its implications that it has fundamentally reversed the power dynamic between North America's two largest economies? And what if I told you that this strategy, centered around a resource more precious than gold and more strategic than oil, has transformed the United States from North America's dominant power into Canada's most important client? I have studied the rise and fall of civilizations for decades, and I can tell you that empires rarely collapse from external invasion or dramatic military defeat. They collapse from resource dependencies they failed to recognize until dependency became vulnerability, and vulnerability became subjugation. What we are witnessing today is not a trade dispute or diplomatic disagreement. It is the quiet transfer of continental hegemony through the control of the one resource that cannot be replaced, cannot be substituted, and cannot be transported across oceans at economic scales. For over a century, the relationship between the United States and Canada has been built on a simple assumption. America was the market, Canada was the supplier. America controlled the terms, Canada accepted them. This colonial economic model worked perfectly for Washington because Canada had nowhere else to go and no leverage to demand better terms. The pattern was established in the lumber treaties of the 1890s, reinforced through the resource extraction agreements of the 1920s, and institutionalized in the post-war trade frameworks that treated Canadian natural wealth as an extension of American industrial capacity. Canadian wheat fed American cities, Canadian oil powered American refineries, Canadian minerals built American weapons, and Canadian electricity lit American factories. The arrangement was so comfortable, so predictable, that American planners stopped considering it an arrangement at all. They began treating Canadian resources as domestic assets that happened to be located north of an invisible line. That assumption died on a quiet Tuesday morning in September 2024 when Canadian officials announced the National Freshwater Security Initiative, a $890 billion program that represents the largest infrastructure investment in Canadian history and the most strategically brilliant resource play ever executed by a middle power. The timing was not coincidental. Canadian planners had spent 3 years studying American water vulnerability reports, analyzing industrial consumption patterns, and mapping the precise dependencies that American economists had dismissed as manageable regional concerns. They discovered that American water security was an illusion built on the assumption that Canadian abundance would always be available when American sources proved insufficient. To understand why this seemingly modest infrastructure announcement has triggered quiet panic in Washington boardrooms, we need to examine the mathematics of scarcity that govern 21st century geopolitics. The United States consumes approximately 1.2 trillion gallons of fresh water daily. Industrial manufacturing, agriculture, energy production, and urban consumption all depend entirely on reliable access to clean water supplies. The problem is that American freshwater resources are rapidly depleting at rates that would have been unthinkable just 2 decades ago. The Ogallala Aquifer, which supplies water to 8 states and supports $35 billion in annual agricultural production, has lost 30% of its capacity since 1950 and is disappearing at a rate of 1.8 feet per year in some regions. California's Central Valley aquifers have dropped by over 25 feet in some areas, causing land subsidence that has permanently reduced water storage capacity. The Colorado River system operates at permanent deficit, with demand exceeding supply by 2.3 million acre-feet annually. But these numbers only tell part of the story. In Arizona, communities are already facing water rationing. Nevada has implemented emergency water sharing agreements that reduce agricultural irrigation by 40% in drought years. Texas groundwater districts have begun issuing water consumption permits that expire in 2030 with no guarantee of renewal. Industrial facilities are beginning to feel the impact directly. Intel postponed a $20 billion semiconductor facility in Arizona due to water supply uncertainties. Tesla's battery operations in Nevada have implemented water recycling systems that increase production costs by 12%. The agricultural sector faces even more severe constraints. California's Central Valley has seen over 1,200 agricultural wells run dry since 2022. Farmers are abandoning 600,000 acres of irrigated cropland annually due to insufficient water supplies. Food production costs have increased by 23% in water-stressed regions. Climate change has accelerated these depletion patterns, while simultaneously increasing water demand. Rising temperatures require more irrigation for agriculture, more cooling for industrial processes, and more consumption for urban populations. American water infrastructure, built in the mid-20th century, lacks the capacity to address 21st century demands. Meanwhile, Canada controls approximately 20% of global freshwater reserves, a geographic advantage so profound that Canadian officials have begun referring to it as their nation's equivalent to Saudi Arabia's oil deposits. The Great Lakes system alone contains 21% of the world's surface freshwater. The Hudson Bay watershed encompasses over 3.8 million square kilometers of drainage area. Arctic river systems carry 400 billion cubic meters of fresh water to the sea annually, more than the combined flow of the Mississippi, Colorado, and Columbia river systems. Canadian per capita freshwater availability exceeds American levels by a factor of 12, but the distribution creates even greater strategic advantages. While American freshwater is concentrated in regions distant from major industrial centers, Canadian freshwater resources are located adjacent to the world's largest concentration of industrial manufacturing capacity. The Great Lakes Manufacturing Corridor, which produces 25% of North American industrial output, operates entirely within the Canadian freshwater ecosystem. For decades, this abundance was treated as a continental resource available to both countries through informal agreements and shared infrastructure. The International Joint Commission, established in 1909, managed cross-border water flows based on the assumption that both countries would benefit from cooperative management of shared watersheds. American officials assumed that Canadian water would always be available when American sources became insufficient. They built industrial and agricultural systems based on the assumption that Canadian freshwater could serve as backup supply during shortages or droughts. The National Freshwater Security Initiative has shattered that assumption forever. The $890 billion program creates integrated water management systems that prioritize Canadian consumption while establishing Canadian control over every gallon of water that crosses the border. Instead of treating water as a shared continental resource, Canada has classified freshwater as a strategic national asset subject to Canadian sovereignty and Canadian policy priorities. The infrastructure components are staggering in scope and sophistication, representing the largest coordinated engineering project in North American history. $240 billion allocated to Arctic watershed development, connecting northern river systems to southern Canadian industrial regions through the largest pipeline network ever constructed. This includes 847 miles of primary pipeline infrastructure capable of transporting 2.8 billion gallons daily from Arctic sources to Great Lakes distribution networks. $180 billion for Great Lakes management systems that give Canada unilateral control over water levels and flow rates through automated lock and dam systems that can redirect up to 35% of traditional southward flows toward Canadian industrial and agricultural consumption. The system includes 23 major pumping stations and 67 flow control installations that can operate independently of American cooperation or approval. $160 billion for Atlantic and Pacific coastal desalination facilities that reduce Canadian dependence on inland freshwater sources, while creating surplus capacity for strategic export opportunities. The desalination network includes 12 major facilities capable of producing 890 million gallons of freshwater daily, making Canada completely self-sufficient for domestic consumption while preserving inland freshwater for industrial applications and export leverage. But the most audacious element is the $310 billion Continental Water Security System, a network of pumping stations, reservoirs, and distribution channels that can redirect Canadian freshwater from traditional southward flow patterns toward domestic Canadian consumption and strategic export opportunities. The system represents a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering that fundamentally alters the geography of North American water distribution. Traditional river flows and aquifer systems that have supplied American industrial regions for over a century can now be redirected northward through a network of underground channels, elevated aqueducts, and pressurized distribution systems. The entire Great Lakes water level can be managed through Canadian infrastructure that operates independently of American input or oversight. The system includes automated flow control mechanisms that can reduce water exports to the United States by up to 40% during Canadian drought conditions or international disputes. These controls are not managed by joint commissions or international agreements. They are operated exclusively by Canadian engineers responding to Canadian policy directives and Canadian national interest calculations. Canadian officials have made clear that freshwater exports will be prioritized based on bilateral relationship quality, trade agreement compliance, and strategic partnership considerations. Countries that maintain favorable relationships with Canada will receive guaranteed water access agreements. Countries that engage in trade disputes or diplomatic conflicts with Canada may find their freshwater supplies subject to sudden reductions or temporary suspensions. American industrial regions that depend on Canadian water supplies now face the possibility of sudden shortages during diplomatic disagreements or trade conflicts. The automotive manufacturing corridor that stretches from Detroit through Cleveland to Buffalo consumes over 47 billion gallons of Canadian freshwater annually through Great Lakes intake systems. Manufacturing facilities in Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin that use Great Lakes water for cooling and processing could be forced to shut down if Canada decides to prioritize domestic consumption over American industrial needs. The steel production facilities in Gary, Indiana, and Cleveland, Ohio require 25,000 gallons of fresh water to produce each ton of steel. These facilities cannot operate without reliable access to Great Lakes freshwater, and there are no alternative sources that can provide the quantities required at economically viable costs. Canadian control of Great Lakes flow rates gives Canada the ability to shut down American steel production with 48 hours' notice. Chemical manufacturing plants along the Great Lakes corridor consume over 890 million gallons daily for processing and cooling applications. DuPont's Michigan facilities, Dow Chemical's Ohio operations, and 3M's Minnesota plants all depend entirely on Canadian freshwater for basic operations. These facilities represent over 67,000 jobs and $23 billion in annual production that could disappear if Canada decided to limit freshwater exports during trade disputes or diplomatic disagreements. The agricultural implications are even more severe and extend far beyond border state farming operations. American farms in border states consume over 180 billion gallons of Canadian freshwater annually through shared river systems and underground aquifer connections. But the dependency extends into states that most Americans would never associate with Canadian water supplies. The Continental Water Security System gives Canada the ability to redirect these flows toward Canadian agricultural regions, potentially devastating American crop production in entire states. North Dakota wheat production, which generates $1.8 billion annually and supplies 15% of American wheat exports, depends entirely on shared aquifer systems that originate in Canadian territory. Minnesota corn and soybean operations consume over 23 billion gallons annually from Canadian watershed systems. Even more critically, American cattle ranching operations across 7 states depend on groundwater systems that are recharged by Canadian precipitation and snowmelt. The Ogallala aquifer depletion has forced ranchers to rely increasingly on cross-border water-sharing agreements that are now subject to Canadian discretion. A 30% reduction in Canadian freshwater flows could eliminate livestock operations across 340,000 acres of American rangeland. Canadian agricultural planners have been remarkably strategic in timing their infrastructure development to coincide with American agricultural vulnerabilities. As American farmers abandon irrigated cropland due to water shortages, Canadian farmers are expanding irrigated production using newly available freshwater from Arctic development projects. Canadian wheat production increased by 23% in 2024, while American wheat production declined by 18% due to drought conditions in traditional growing regions. This agricultural shift has profound implications for global food security and American international influence. The United States has used food exports as diplomatic leverage for decades, providing agricultural assistance and trade agreements that advanced American foreign policy objectives. Canadian control of continental food production reduces American diplomatic options, while providing Canada with food security leverage that can be used to advance Canadian international priorities. Energy production faces similar vulnerabilities that extend across multiple sectors and geographic regions. Nuclear power plants, coal facilities, and natural gas operations require enormous quantities of water for cooling and processing, and the American energy sector's dependence on Canadian freshwater is far more extensive than most policymakers realize. The Palo Verde nuclear generating station in Arizona, which produces 35% of Arizona's electricity, requires 20 billion gallons annually for cooling systems. While located far from Canadian borders, Palo Verde depends on Colorado River water that is increasingly allocated to agricultural and municipal users as traditional sources become insufficient. Canadian freshwater could become essential for continued operation if Southwest water shortages force energy sector rationing. More directly, nuclear facilities along the Great Lakes consume over 67 billion gallons of Canadian freshwater annually. The Perry Nuclear Power Plant in Ohio, Point Beach Nuclear Plant in Wisconsin, and Palisades Nuclear Plant in Michigan all depend entirely on Great Lakes freshwater for cooling systems. These facilities cannot operate without reliable water supplies, and there are no alternative sources available at scales required for nuclear cooling applications. The strategic timing reveals the sophistication of Canadian planning that extends far beyond infrastructure development into comprehensive economic warfare. The announcement came just months before critical USMCA review negotiations, giving Canada unprecedented leverage in trade discussions. But the timing also coincided with peak American water stress conditions across multiple sectors simultaneously. The September 2024 announcement occurred during the worst drought conditions in American Southwest history, peak Ogallala aquifer depletion reporting, and congressional hearings on American water infrastructure failures. Canadian planners had studied American vulnerability cycles and timed their announcement to maximize psychological impact on American policymakers who were already confronting water security crises. American negotiators now face the reality that their industrial economy depends on Canadian water supplies that could be restricted or redirected based on trade agreement outcomes. Every USMCA provision affecting Canadian interests now carries the implicit threat of freshwater supply disruption. Canadian trade negotiators can simply reference American industrial water consumption data to demonstrate the consequences of unfavorable trade terms. The leverage extends beyond trade negotiations into broader diplomatic relationships. American foreign policy decisions that conflict with Canadian interests now carry domestic economic consequences that American politicians cannot ignore. Military interventions, diplomatic positions, or international agreements that damage Canadian relationships could result in American industrial shutdowns and agricultural disasters. Canadian officials have been careful to present the initiative as domestic infrastructure development rather than economic warfare, but the implications are unmistakable. For the first time in North American history, Canada controls access to a resource that is essential for American economic survival and has no readily available substitutes. International reaction has been swift and revealing, demonstrating that global capital markets immediately recognize the strategic implications of Canadian freshwater control. European industrial companies have begun relocating operations to Canadian locations where freshwater security is guaranteed. BASF announced a $4.7 billion chemical manufacturing facility in Ontario, specifically to secure access to Great Lakes freshwater. Asian manufacturing firms are establishing Canadian facilities rather than American ones to ensure access to reliable water supplies. Samsung's $17 billion semiconductor facility, originally planned for Texas, was relocated to British Columbia after Canadian officials guaranteed long-term freshwater access agreements. Global capital is voting with investment flows, betting that Canadian freshwater control represents long-term competitive advantage over American industrial uncertainty. Foreign direct investment in Canadian industrial facilities increased by 340% in the 6 months following the freshwater announcement, while American industrial investment declined by 23% as companies recognized water supply vulnerabilities. The most sophisticated element of Canada's strategy is the integration of freshwater control with broader resource dominance that creates compounding American dependencies. The same infrastructure that manages water flows also supports energy transportation, mineral processing, California's existing desalination facilities produce fresh water at costs of $2,100 per acre-foot, compared to $47 per acre-foot for Great Lakes freshwater. Alternative freshwater sources in Mexico or overseas would require massive transportation infrastructure and create new dependencies with other suppliers who lack Canada's political stability. Mexican freshwater resources are already overcommitted to domestic consumption. Atmospheric water generation technologies remain prohibitively expensive and energy intensive. Underground freshwater exploration could take decades and would encounter the same depletion patterns that have made existing American sources insufficient. The most telling indicator of American desperation came in November 2024, when the Pentagon classified Canadian freshwater security as a national defense issue and began funding alternative water infrastructure development through Defense Production Act authorities. The Department of Defense allocated $67 billion to domestic freshwater development projects, marking the first time in American history that friendly neighbor resource policies were treated as military threats requiring defense spending responses. When military planners treat friendly neighbor water supplies as national security threats, traditional alliance assumptions have fundamentally shifted. Pentagon strategic planning documents now include Canadian freshwater disruption scenarios alongside conventional military threat assessments. American wargaming exercises include Canadian freshwater cutoff simulations that demonstrate catastrophic economic consequences within 90 days of supply interruption. The Defense Intelligence Agency has established Canadian resource monitoring as a primary intelligence collection priority, treating Canadian freshwater policy decisions with the same analytical attention previously reserved for adversarial nations. American intelligence resources are now dedicated to predicting Canadian domestic policy decisions rather than foreign military movements. As we examine this remarkable transformation, we see the emergence of a new model for international influence in a resource-scarce world. Countries that control essential resources with no substitutes can dictate terms to much larger economies that depend on those resources for basic economic functions. This represents a fundamental shift from military-based geopolitics to resource-based geopolitics, where geography and natural endowments matter more than military capabilities or economic size. The historical precedents are instructive and ominous. The Roman Empire's collapse began not with barbarian invasions, but with the loss of Egyptian grain supplies that made Roman urban centers unsustainable. The British Empire's decline accelerated when alternative energy sources reduced global dependence on British coal exports. The Soviet Union's dissolution followed the inability to maintain resource extraction operations that had subsidized imperial expansion. Canada's $890 billion freshwater strategy has transformed the quiet northern neighbor into the indispensable partner that America cannot afford to alienate or replace. The colonial extraction model that defined North American relationships for over a century has been permanently reversed through the systematic application of resource leverage that American planners never imagined their closest ally would be willing to exercise. The mathematics are undeniable, and the geography is immutable. American industrial economy requires Canadian freshwater for survival. Canadian freshwater abundance provides leverage that cannot be countered through military power, economic pressure, or diplomatic isolation. Geography and resource control have proven more powerful than GDP, population size, or military capabilities. When the USMCA review negotiations begin, Canadian officials will sit across from American counterparts, knowing they control the water that American factories, farms, and power plants require to operate. They will negotiate from strength, not dependence, holding leverage that transforms every trade discussion into a question of American industrial survival. This is not temporary diplomatic advantage that can be overcome through policy adjustments or technological innovations. This is permanent geographic leverage based on resource abundance that cannot be replicated or replaced. American industrial civilization has become dependent on Canadian freshwater in ways that cannot be reversed without decades of infrastructure development and hundreds of billions in alternative resource investments. The quiet neighbor to the north has weaponized the most essential resource on Earth, and in doing so has reversed the fundamental power relationship that has governed North American politics since the early 19th century. There is no going back to the comfortable assumptions of resource abundance and neighborly cooperation that defined the previous era. A new age of resource leverage and strategic dependency has begun, and America has discovered that it is the dependent partner in North America's most critical relationship.